whether it's closing a Vermont Yankee or whether or not we have a democratic process by which we have health care, or whether this country goes to war or not, unelected and unaccountable corporate CEOs are not just exercising power today, they are ruling us. As surely as masters once ruled slaves, as surely as kings once ruled subjects, unelected and unaccountable corporate CEOs are ruling us because they're making the fundamental public policy decisions that affect all of our lives. And I believe that these two related legal doctrines of corporations claiming constitutional rights and money as speech is the linchpin for how this has happened, and we believe at Move to Amend that there is a growing democracy movement in this country that we are part of, and we are excited to be working with Vermonters to actually help to nurture and build this movement. I'm going to actually just lay out the analysis on why abolish corporate constitutional rights. In order to do that, let's just ask, what is the supreme law of the land, the governing document for how our federal government is supposed to operate?
Money.
What is the document by which we are supposed to be governing ourselves? The U.S. Constitution. How many of you have actually read the U.S. Constitution? Lots of hands go up. So y'all grade my paper. See if I get this more or less right. I will assert that when you read the U.S. Constitution in its entirety and look at it, as my mama would say, step back from the fabric. See the tapestry, see the whole pattern. I will argue that the way, when you look at the U.S. Constitution that way, you'll see two principal actors at play. The first actor is the most important actor. In fact, it's so important, it's the first three words.
We the people.
We the people. And those are hallowed words in this country, and they should be. You see, we the people come together in this framework in order to create the second actor. And the second actor is government itself. It's worth noting that government does not precede the people. In fact, government is dependent upon the people. That's because we, the people, in this document are described and understood to be free and sovereign. And the word sovereign means literally claiming the authority to rule. You see, government actually does not have the authority to rule. Government is not sovereign. In fact, to the contrary, government is subordinate and accountable. Government is subordinate to whom? The people. Government is accountable to whom? The people. That's got a ring to it, doesn't it? I like how that flows. We the people are free and sovereign because we the people have rights. Government does not have rights. Government only has duties. And the difference between rights and duties is profound. You see, if I have the right to do something, it means I may simply do it, and I don't need anybody's permission. I don't need the city of Burlington's permission. I don't need the state of Vermont's permission. I don't need the federal government's permission. If you have the right to do something, you can just damn well do it. And get this, if any law, local, state, or federal law, actually infringes upon a constitutionally recognized right, government's wrong, not you, and you should be able to go into court and overturn such a law, because such a law would be utterly unconstitutional. Now, government does not have rights at all over the people. Government only has duties. And where do those government duties come from? Well, think of it this way. All the political power resides with the people. Right? We've heard that. In fact, it raises to a chant and a consciousness when there are real movements. Power to the people. All the political power resides with the people. And that is a phenomenal, profound way of understanding political power. And at the same time, I have to ask this question. Does anybody know the population, more or less, of Burlington, Vermont? 42,000 people, more or less. I will celebrate and applaud the fact that 42,000 Burlington, Vermont residents have all the political power. But I'll tell you this, I don't want to go to the meeting of 42,000 people where decisions are made about where to put stop signs. And I like political meetings, and I'm not going to that one. So all the power resides with the people. However, we the people delegate a certain amount of our power to government. How much power do we delegate to government? Only enough to perform the duties that we the people have already authorized them to perform. And government's duties are discharged by writing laws or legislation. And whether it's at the local, state, or federal level, that's how government discharges its duties. Think of it this way. In our private realm, we have core rights that cannot be violated as individuals. However, the operation of government and the laws are supposed to be a reflection of public values and are supposed to be in the public interest. That's the reason that laws are written. Makes sense so far, right? In fact, so to say it all together, as a refresher really for our introductory civics class, all political power is held by the people. We, the people, are free and sovereign. However, we delegate a certain amount of our power to government, which is subordinate and accountable to we, the people. Government discharges its duties by writing particular laws in the public interest, but the one thing government can never do is to write a law that violates the individual rights of any person. Isn't that brilliant, actually? Isn't the American political theory wonderful? This is fantastic. It satisfies my civil libertarian impulses and my public communitarian impulses. This is fantastic. This is wonderful. We should try that in this country. This would work. And I'm not even joking, folks, because the problem is not in this framework. The problem is it's in implementation. And before I go 1 second further waxing poetic about how brilliant and beautiful the U.S. Constitution is, time out. Somebody tell me what year this document gets ratified and becomes the supreme law of the land. 1787 is the Constitutional Convention itself, and it becomes ratified and becomes the supreme law of the land in 1789. I want to be clear that the founding of this country, for all its brilliance at rejecting monarchy as a form of rule, and for all its rhetoric of a genuine Republican form of government, the reality is, in its initial implementation, it was a founding violence. A founding violence against the indigenous who were already here and subject to intentional, deliberate genocide. That's the truth. It's a founding violence against the Africans who were brought at the barrel of a gun or the point of a spear and forced to build this country. Barack Obama occupies a White House built by enslaved Africans. That's the truth. It is a founding violence against women. Because it's not just that women couldn't vote. I mean, that's the least of it, really. Women couldn't even own property. Women were property by any reasonable understanding of that word and their degree of subjugation by the men in their lives and the culture in which they lived. And it's a founding violence against most of the white men who were here. Because most of the white men were either indentured servants or at best second-class citizens because they were not wealthy enough and did not own enough property to be fully participatory in this beautiful Republican form of government. So, I like to quote Howard Zinn, who observed that history requires a lens because we're looking back at something. I believe the most appropriate lens to look at history in the United States is as a series of struggles by actual human beings to be described as legal person with rights that are protected and recognized by our Constitution. That's so important, I'm going to say it again. The most important way to really understand the arc of U.S. history is as a series of struggles by actual human beings to be defined legally as persons with rights that would be protected by our Constitution. In order to place the corporation within this framework, I'll ask this question very quickly. Does anybody know what it takes to form a corporation in Vermont today?
$25.
You file a document with the Secretary of State and $25. So as long as you have filed your paperwork correctly and your $25 check clears, do you know what the Secretary of State will do? They will rubber stamp that document and issue you a charter. And that charter actually creates the corporation, right? And how long can your corporation last in Vermont? Forever, as long as you pay your annual filing fees. And, by the way, what can you do with a corporate charter in Vermont, according to Vermont law? Answer, all lawful things. That's actually how it reads. Some of us argue, well, apparently if you have enough money, you can also do a lot of unlawful things and get away with it. But the point I'm making is that today, in contemporary society, we don't even really think about these institutions and where did they come from and why do they exist and why do they have so much power in our society today. I say that to frame this historical bit of information. In 1789, and for the first 75 years of this country, here's what it took to get a corporate charter issued by the state. You had to first identify a public need that was not being met by either existing government practice or by private business that did not have the privilege of limited liability. And if you were as you began that application process, you had to get the lower house of the state government to pass it by a majority, then you had to get the state senate to pass it by a majority, and then the governor had to sign it. The point I'm making is that today corporate charters can be issued willy-nilly, but at one time in our country, they were very tightly controlled to even be issued. Oh, and get this, if a corporate charter was issued, do you know how long it would last? Typically 3 years, 5 years, no longer than 20 years. Every corporate charter was actually limited in duration, and the limited liability dissolved at the end of that time period. And if people wanted to continue to do business under the auspices of and with the privilege of limited liability, then you had to reapply all over again. Oh, and that's not all. If you were ever found to do anything other than the specific public need that you had already identified, if you were going ultra vires or beyond the scope of your corporate charter, do you know what happened to a corporate charter? It was revoked. Corporate charters were revoked, oftentimes for doing nothing more harmful than merely doing business beyond the scope of the initial charter. Oh, and by the way, even if you were acting within your specific time period, even if you're doing the specific need that you had identified, if you were ever found to be violating the public interest or the public trust in any way, do you know what happened to the corporate charter? Corporate charters were revoked for that reason as well. The point I'm making is not that in 1789 it's the land of milk and honey. After all, slavery existed. The patriarchy was real and oppressive and explicit and clear. And most white men were being oppressed as workers, without a doubt. What I am saying is the instrument of the corporation was appropriately controlled through the legislative process. That it takes an act of state government to create the corporate charter. We know that that charter can be and has historically been used to hold the corporation subordinate and accountable. We know that the corporate charter describes the duties of what a corporation can do, and since I will assert that the only reason a corporate charter should be issued with the privilege of limited liability is if it's acting in the public interest, isn't it obvious that a corporation should be under the democratic control of we the people through our elected process? And that's the kicker. Corporate personhood is a court-created legal doctrine where the court says, even though the word corporation is never mentioned in our Constitution, we are going to assert that a corporation should be considered a person with rights under this document. It perverts this whole framework. And that's the payoff. Corporate personhood is the idea that a corporation is a person with rights, and that therefore democratically enacted laws at the local, state, or federal level might violate those rights. And corporate lawyers can go into court and overturn these rights. And it is definitely the case that worker protection laws have been overturned on the allegations that worker protection laws are violating corporations' constitutional rights. Public health and public safety laws have been overturned on the argument that they violate the rights of corporations. So too have environmental protection laws been overturned on the basis that they violate the rights of the Constitution. And I will argue that campaign finance laws have been overturned, arguing that they violate the rights of corporations. And so, the point I'm making and the point that we're making is what we need in this country is not a good policy. There's plenty of good policy. We don't even need good legislation. There's plenty of good proposed legislation. What we need is a democracy movement. A movement where we, the people, are asserting our sovereignty, that we have the authority, that we have the right, and I would say that we have the responsibility to actually protect our environment, to protect workers, to protect the public health and the public safety, to protect the integrity of our elections. And who do we need to be protecting it from? The ruling elite. The reality is that we don't have a functioning democratic republic. The reality is that a small ruling elite have hijacked virtually every one of the institutions of this country, and they are using our institutions against us. And as a lawyer, what really makes me angry is that they use the legal system to legalize virtually every one of the harms and abuses that they're doing. So I'm happy to report to you, and I will celebrate with Vermont, that at town meeting you passed 64 warrants calling for a constitutional amendment to abolish corporate personhood and to establish that money is not speech. That's fantastic. And you have already been joined by Missoula, Montana, by Boulder, Colorado, by Madison, Wisconsin, where they did the same thing on the ballot. Citizens got to vote on it, and it won by 74, 75, and 82% respectively. And if that's not enough, we have already helped to pass resolutions basically exactly like the language that you used in Vermont, in New York City, in Los Angeles, California, in Albany, New York, across the country. These resolutions are happening, and the movement is just beginning. Peace.